Welcome to NCC. We're glad you're here. Thank you for trying out a lecture. You can learn at your own pace, contact the professor with questions, and meet with other students and the professor for lunch every month. We have many options for learning. Please enjoy, and we'll be in touch by email, or you can contact us at any time.
Professor Brian Alnutt of New Tripoli, Pennsylvania, has taught history at Northampton Community College since 2009. Born in Philadelphia, he was raised in southern New Jersey and belongs to the Nanticoke Lenni Lenape Indian tribe of New Jersey. Professor Alnutt has particular interests in 19th and 20th century American history, foreign policy, and American ethnic and race relations.
Hello and greetings, and welcome to some thoughts about the presence of blacks in the Old West, and particularly about the black military units known as the Buffalo Soldiers. What do we mean by the Old? Let's define our terms first. What do we mean by the Old West? It's not a very carefully defined, precisely defined term, but what I'm referring to here is that period of time in the Western U.S. from the years just before the Civil War through the early 20th century. That's a time we think of as the Old West, the West of pioneers and homesteaders and cowboys and battles against Native Americans and railroad building, that period of time. And we wanted to think about the role and the presence of blacks there. And once again, focusing especially on the black units, all black military units, known as colloquial as the Buffalo Soldiers. By the way, here you see, as we begin here, some artwork by the legendary Western artist Frederick Remington, showing his impression of some of these black soldiers preparing to ride off on patrol. So it kind of shows the respect. Remington was someone who was deeply in love with what he saw as the bravery, the rigors of the Old West, and it kind of shows his respect for the black troops here. So what is our traditional, and I might say conventional view of the old American West? Well, you can kind of get an impression from what you see right here. It really has come down, especially during the peak time of interest in the West, which was up until the early to mid 20th century, really come down as a white presence. You see the commercial Marlboro man on the left. You see John Wayne leading cavalry there. This is a role, a depiction of a West in which, these sort of inspiring, you might say, roles of cowboys and pioneers and charging cavalry were really depicted as being all white. And, you might ask, why is that? Because you're going to see later on that that's simply not at all how it was. I'm going to describe that now. I'm going to come back to this. At the time of peak Western media, which was from the pulp novels of the late 19th century right through the movie era of the early to mid 20th century into early television, it was a very, frankly, racist time. One of the peak times of racism in the Western world. It was known, and we call it, sort of not inaccurately, scientific racism. A real belief that, that whites, in particularly Northern European whites, were sort of the leading edge of human civilization. And that other races, whether they be Native Americans or blacks or Asians, fell somewhere below this and weren't entitled to honor or visibility. Could only be in subservient roles. That was simply the ethos of the time. And that's the time when really the peak for imagery and the capture of the popular imagination of the West was really being created. So we're going to see that there was a very large black presence, but that presence did not translate into the popular imagination. And this is pretty much what did. So I like to kind of challenge that now from a historical point of view and just look at what the reality of it actually was. And the reality is, blacks were present in the pioneering West from very early years. On the left there you see Jim Beckworth, who at the time was really a famous fur trapper, pioneer, so-called mountain man, you might say. Someone who lived in the West, was involved in trapping and scouting work, who was involved with Native American tribes, especially the Crow tribe. and who did, in fact, help lead and guide white settlers and military men heading west, especially during the era of the Mexican-American War. So Beckworth was pretty well known. He really fits everything you might expect from our image of a Western frontiersman. Yet his memory was kind of suppressed and minimized throughout the late 19th, early 20th centuries. On the right, you see an image from the famous California gold rush. This began in 1849, shortly after the Mexican-American War, and California had been captured. And now here you see some pioneers working away, prospectors working a gold strike. A fair number of blacks came. A lot of people poured into California during the gold rush. The population of the territory increased multiple times. A lot of Eastern whites headed west. A lot of European immigrant whites headed west. For the first time, many East Asians came to the U.S. to work in the California gold mines. And a lot of Black Americans headed west to work. Mostly men, not many women, but some women. Some of these men were freed slaves. Some of them were just simply free blacks. And although California was not a slave state, it was a so-called free state, there could be de facto slavery sometimes. And a few Southern slave owners during this time did head west and brought their black slaves with them, who remained in slavery, although it was against the laws of California. There were a few of them there, but I'd say most of the blacks involved in this pioneering work were free blacks. They did face, as you might expect in this era, a certain amount of discrimination, unequal treatment, but they were there staking their fortunes and living lives of frontier freedom that they would not have been able to live, certainly not in the pre-Civil War South. So yeah, there's definitely a black role. It goes beyond just prospectors. During that same period, other blacks, including some women, established themselves in California. Well, not very large numbers, but definitely visible. You see two of them right here. Biddy Mason, who lived around Los Angeles, Mary Ellen Pleasance in San Francisco. And both these women were involved in business development. They had small businesses. Biddy Mason bought a lot of real estate, became very powerful in Los Angeles real estate. They both fought for civil rights, especially Mary Ellen Pleasance. San Francisco, as it grew, did develop typical patterns of segregation, which were also common in the northern U.S., northeastern U.S. at the time, and such as on horse cars, public transit, in schools, etc. And Mary Ellen Pleasance fought as best she could to defeat that and overcome these kinds of early segregation. So there's definitely a black role here, especially in the gold fields and the growing urban centers of California. Another later form of black civilian presence in the West involves a group called the Exodusters. And they took their name from the Bible, Book of Exodus, of course. These are Southern blacks. After the Reconstruction era collapsed really in violence by the mid-1870s, and the groups like the Ku Klux Klan became very, very powerful, and segregation and sharecropping began to tighten their grip on the South. Blacks saw their lives really become, deteriorating pretty quickly. And a number of black promoters said the future for black Southerners really lies in the West. It's a time when many Americans look to the West for opportunities and, follow the setting sun, that sort of imagery. And these black promoters said, why shouldn't Southern blacks do the same thing? So these guys were sometimes land speculators. They bought land in the West and encouraged blacks to leave the South and head out there, especially the new state of Kansas. It was seen as a land of promise. It had been anti-slavery before the Civil War, and these promoters saw a real big future for blacks if they moved en masse to Kansas and established themselves there. So from the late 1870s on, this was a pretty common scene along the wharves in, say, Memphis, Tennessee. Large numbers of blacks, thousands, dropping everything and heading west to start new lives in Kansas, and they did so. Forms, in many cases, all black towns. Here you see Nicodemus, an all black town in eastern Kansas, and these are made up of farmers, in some cases ranchers, small business people, shopkeepers, trying to really create a future in the state. It was not paradise. there was racism in Kansas as well as other places. And if you think ahead to our era, well, 1950s, put it that way, you may recall that the famous Brown versus Board of Education school segregation case was in Topeka, Kansas. It was not involving the South. Well, some Southern presence in that case, but the namesake case was Topeka, Kansas. So it did not become a land of real equality, but it's certainly better than staying in the increasingly segregated and white supremacist South was. So these blacks saw opportunity here. The towns really thrived for a while. Unfortunately, as time went on, many of these towns were plagued by drought. Some of the railroads that were so essential to prosperity as they grew bypassed these towns. So they did not really grow into the metropolises that their promoters expected. Some of them became rather poor. And some of the blacks moved onwards from Kansas further into the Southwest. The new state of Oklahoma, which was just transforming from Indian territory. They sought futures there and began building up black towns and black farms in Oklahoma. Once again, thinking ahead into the future, one of those prospering black towns in Oklahoma was near Tulsa. It's called Greenwood. And as Tulsa grew, it incorporated Greenwood. Greenwood became part of Tulsa. Still mainly a black town with many black businesses, known as the Black Wall Street. And if you're thinking ahead to where I'm going, the famous 1921 Tulsa race riot involved huge black mobs ransacking and burning Greenwood. And it did recover to some degree after that, but that was sort of the sad fate of that. Let's think about cowboys. Homesteaders are one thing, farmers are one thing, but the real sort of focus of Western imagination has oftentimes been the cowboy. And we think oftentimes of cowboys, as I showed before, as being all white. But about a quarter of working cowboys were blacks. Absolutely true. Here you see some right here. These guys are in northern Texas. About a quarter of working cowboys were blacks. Driving cattle, ranching, doing everything a cowboy does. Sharpshooting in some cases. On the right, you see a character named Nat Love, who got the nickname Deadwood Dick. He moved up to Deadwood and became a famous trick shot. Some of these guys were famous for their marksmanship. About a quarter of working cowboys were blacks. And if you want to think about, why don't our popular depictions of cowboys, at least in the past, ever show blacks, it's because that was suppressed. Once again, media were being produced during a time of real racism, and the thought was to avoid, quote, offending any viewers and just show whites in this role. So large numbers of Native American cowboys were kind of erased out of the picture. Fair number of Mexican American cowboys were not depicted except as villains in some cases. And the blacks almost entirely disappeared from popular media. And here we are, rediscovering that, in fact, they were very much there. Now let's consider and get on to our real focus, the famous Buffalo Soldiers. Here's another picture by Frederick Remington, the artist, showing them charging into battle. Who are they? Well, their origins really lie during the U.S. Civil War. Before the Civil War, there had not been really blacks enlisted in the U.S. Army at all. Civil War broke out. Neither side, North or South, would agree to enlist black soldiers. It was thought to be a white man's war. But by 1863, about halfway through, President Lincoln's administration, after the Emancipation Proclamation, thought it would be an excellent idea to enlist black soldiers who would fight energetically to defeat the South and help bring the Union back together. So they began energetically recruiting blacks into segregated, separate, all-black units led by white officers. If anyone's ever seen the famous film Glory, starring Denzel Washington, it shows one of those units in action. These black units, in some cases, comprised 10, 20% of Union Army field forces. And they fought from South Carolina to Virginia, out to Tennessee, in many famous battles, establishing a good record of military success and cool under fire. I want to address a rumor that's been floating around that the Confederacy also enlisted many black soldiers. This is not true. Um, Confederate politicians, for racial reasons, had no intention of enlisting blacks and resisted it till the bitter end. Even when the military officers, as the South was collapsing, began calling for black troops, Southern politicians refused on racial grounds. They finally relented by 1865 when everything was falling apart, and they did begin enlisting some black troops. One wonders, why would these blacks have fought for the Confederacy when the North was obviously going to free the slaves? The South was making some vague promises of freedom for black soldiers. In any case, it didn't amount to anything, because by the time these black units were ready to fight for the Confederacy, the collapse had happened and the Confederacy had been defeated. So the black role in the Civil War is really in the Union Army. And when the war was over, the Union Army rapidly demobilized. The thinking was to get the troops out of uniform and back to civilian life as quickly as possible. Here you see a returning Union soldier arriving back at his home. Army was reduced quickly from 1 million troops in 1865, an unprecedented number for the U.S. Union Army, down to about 20 or 30,000 2 years later. Just a rapid reduction in numbers, leaving a really skeleton army there to deal with the problems of the day. Not enough military to bring order to the South, and Reconstruction was being attacked by all kinds of white paramilitary groups in the South, and there weren't enough U.S. Army troops to actually bring order there. And the western frontier, the western U.S., became very tense because this is the time when the war was over, when many whites began, and we saw some blacks too, began heading west looking for that fabled opportunity, heading into territory occupied mostly by Native American tribes, from the Sioux and the Crow in the north, right down the Apache in the south. And, settlers moving west, railroads moving west, tensions were really spiking. And most of what was left of the U.S. Army was then sent west to help establish order there. Now, the remaining U.S. colored troops, those who did not get mustered out, remained in the Army and were reorganized into 4 units: the 24th and 25th Infantry, the 9th and 10th Cavalry. And these were the genesis, the nucleus of what became the Buffalo Soldiers. Numbers much smaller than in the Civil War, but these units were there, volunteering to be there, and sent west into various assignments in the Western territories. The tensions were really building. This is the time when, seeing where things were going, U.S. government pressured local tribes to sign treaties, agreeing to be confined to reservations. That was really the theory of the U.S. government, that the West would become chaotic unless white pioneers heading out would not clash with native tribes, and therefore native tribes should be confined to clearly delineated reservations where they would live, and railroads and white settlers would settle supposedly peacefully around them. This did not go as planned. The treaties were pressured. Many tribes didn't really agree to them at all. They just agreed under pressure. And all kinds of violent combat broke out across the West. And the Buffalo Soldiers were involved in many of these battles. You see on the left, the Saline River in Kansas, 1867, a major battle against the Cheyenne. In the center panel, the so-called Red River War in Texas against the Comanche. That's up in northern Texas, the Panhandle. To the right, you see fighting in Arizona against the Apache. Famous chiefs like Victorio and Geronimo, 1880s, 1890s. In the South, the depiction in the South, that's the Pine Ridge Wars in South Dakota in 1890 against the Sioux. Buffalo soldiers were involved in many of these campaigns, in some cases 10, 20% of battlefield troops here, fighting against these tribes. Here's where they got the nickname Buffalo Soldiers. Some of the tribes people nicknamed them that because of 2 traits they had. One being the fact that they were very brave and charged forward in battle just as the bison did, seen as a very brave, forthright, worthy prey animal for the Indians. The other thing, of course, being their hair texture. Some tribes felt it resembled the buffalo, but the primary nickname was from the tenacity and bravery. So the tribes nicknamed them buffalo soldiers, and these troops kept that nickname as a point of pride. They had a lot of respect from their officers who saw them as being brave and dependable in battle. Now, of course, there is a little bit of irony here. Let's get into some of the complexities here, because I think you can see where this is. It is ironic that this is a war in which Black Americans are fighting hard against Native Americans to confine them to reservations, and that is exactly what was happening here. How can this be? These Black troops saw it as their duty. These are men of duty and honor. They saw this as being the military mission of the U.S. Army. They were involved in that mission, and they were going to do their duty and do their part, and they did so. In our time, we can, of course, we should. Actually, in their time, too, there were some questions about the severity of these missions against tribes. Even at the time, some white Easterners felt that this was unduly violent and harsh. There was, and of course, more questions have been raised in our time. One thing, among others, that you might notice here is the Pine Ridge battles in South Dakota in 1890. Yes, that does correspond to the time of the infamous Wounded Knee Massacre of the Sioux. And yes, Black Buffalo soldiers were nearby at the time. They weren't involved in the massacre. That was a white unit that ended up confronting Sioux who were brandishing weapons, and uncontrolled gunfire broke out, and Sioux were just gunned down. Buffalo troops were not far away, fighting against another unit of Sioux who were coming to support the ones at Wounded Knee, and the Buffalo soldiers did in fact drive those Sioux off. So they weren't directly involved there, but they were in the support role. And it does mean that in our time we might look at this with sort of a questioning eye, but the combat record was very strong, and they were seen as by their white peers as honorable. Here you see a Buffalo soldier in Arizona, standing with some allied native scouts. These are not captured natives. In almost every one of the Indian wars, some natives allied themselves with the U.S. Army because they were doing combat against historic enemies of those tribes, or in some cases personal factional feuds. So some natives will ally themselves with the Army, and that's what's happening here. These are native scouts, Apache, who've allied themselves with the U.S. Army against Geronimo, and there they are with one of the Black troops who's going to be involved with them in battle. And here's a drawing, like another drawing by Frederick Remington, showing his respect for the skills and horsemanship and just general elan of the Buffalo soldiers on the frontier. They had others as well. They served as national park guards. Yes, they did, because in the early days, the national parks such as Yellowstone were under military control, and so Black troops were sent out there as some of the first park guards. Keeping order in the parks, trying to keep crime out, trying to just protect natural resources. A pretty interesting, creative role. They had other roles as well in the West. They were involved in putting down outbreaks of rustling, suppressing outlaws in many cases, actually fighting outlaws in sometimes. Protecting the mails, protecting mail caravans, and protecting railroad construction crews. So the role of Buffalo troops in the West, Buffalo soldiers, was a pretty wide-ranging role. This is a picture. I just wanted to put this in to show that even though we're talking about a Black presence in the West that is more prominent than we think, it's still not a lot of people. I want to bring proportion here. These two maps show the U.S. population density in 1890. And you can see the overall population is still pretty sparse west of the center of the country. You can see that clear delineation between the dense eastern half and the sparsely populated western half. If you look at the Black population, it's much more concentrated in the states of the old Confederacy. There's not a lot of Blacks that you see in Texas, of course, and in eastern Kansas, but there is a presence. Look at California, around the Bay Area. There's definitely a presence. It's not a lot of people, but definitely a larger and more visible role than we're used to thinking about. Buffalo soldiers were also involved after the period of Western organization and settlement in the Spanish-American War, which broke out in 1898. This is a war in which the U.S. was fighting to drive Spain out of its Cuban colony, also out of its Puerto Rican colony, and also ended up capturing the Philippines from Spain. Black troops were sent here in large numbers to fight in Cuba. Part of the reason was because they were seen as possibly being more resistant to malaria, which was going to be a problem in Caribbean combat. So they were sent over with special emphasis, had to travel from their western outposts to Tampa, Florida, to embark for battle. And unfortunately, during these travels throughout the South, coming from Texas and Arizona through the South to Florida, they faced major harassment from locals along the way who could not stand the idea of armed black soldiers in the South. This is a very racist segregationist time. Had insults hurled at their trains. Sometimes the trains had things thrown at them, etc. So they underwent a lot of harassment before they even got to Tampa. Once they got there and embarked for Cuba, they played a major combat role with high honors, especially in the conspicuous victory at what became known as San Juan Hill. This is where Colonel Theodore Roosevelt led his rough riders in a charge towards Spanish positions. It was actually a hill called Kettle Hill. It became known as San Juan Hill in memory because San Juan Hill was nearby. The actual attack was Kettle Hill. Teddy Roosevelt was a military amateur. His unit was under heavy Spanish fire during this, was in grave danger of being defeated. Had it not been for the black troops coming up alongside him, providing protecting fire and also charging against those Spanish positions at the top of Kettle Hill. So they were really critical to helping TR and his Rough Riders eke out that conspicuous victory there. And Roosevelt was appreciative at the time. He was known, and we'll discuss him a little bit later, he was known to be, as a Republican, Northern Republican, rather friendly to blacks. I wouldn't say necessarily pushing for full equality or civil rights, but much more friendly than other political figures of the time. And he did state appreciation to the black units after the victory at Kettle Hill. Later on, though, Roosevelt and the popular press minimized the black role in this and really played up Roosevelt's role in capturing, and his unit's role in capturing that hill. So definitely the black role was minimized as time went on. Another unfortunate interaction of Buffalo soldiers and black troops with Theodore Roosevelt occurred in Texas in the year 1906. What happened here, it was not an actual battle. Black troops had been stationed, the 25th Infantry, near Brownsville in southern Texas. And this is, of course, a very segregationist area. These local whites had a hard time tolerating black troops anywhere near them. A lot of tensions, a lot of insults, and some fist fights. One night after dark, some units or someone from the base, a number of people from the base, went into town and began shooting up Brownsville, shooting in the shop windows, shooting in the houses sometimes. One white man was killed, and local whites pinned the blame on these black troops stationed nearby. You see that newspaper story right there in the middle of the slide. Even though the white commanders of those units, the white officers, swore they had been in barracks, locked in barracks during the time of this rampage, the accusation still stood. A pretty quick investigation was carried out. Blame was pinned on these black troops, and President Teddy Roosevelt, as commander-in-chief, believed that they were guilty and processed dishonorable discharges against more than 160 of these black soldiers, creating a lot of tension. Roosevelt had been seen as rather friendly to black Americans before this. He'd invited Booker T. Washington to the White House, one of the first times a black man had dinner with the president in the White House. The South was outraged by that. Southern whites were. And when the Brownsville discharges happened, blacks were also feeling betrayed by this friend Roosevelt. You see the poster on the right showing Roosevelt at the top as a friend of black Americans. I believe in the square deal for all of you. At the bottom, he's summarily ejecting good black troops from the army on flimsy evidence. So blacks saw this as a betrayal and became rather suspicious of Roosevelt after this point. But that was one of the difficult low points that shows the tensions that black troops were under during this very segregationist time, despite their service to the country. One more episode of service. In 1916, Mexico was in a state of chaotic civil war, a multi-sided civil war. Battle was on multiple fronts in Mexico. President Woodrow Wilson was aiding one side, President Carranza. And one of the insurgent leaders, Pancho Villa, resented that and actually raided the town of Columbus, New Mexico, shooting up the town and killing a number of people. In retaliation, Wilson ordered a punitive expedition to go into Mexico and try to hunt down Villa. And black troops, you see in the middle picture, played a major role in this expedition. They never found Villa, but they fought well. Their commander was General John Pershing, you see there on the right. And from this time on, he got the nickname Black Jack for leading these black troops. And he became proud of that nickname. And later on in his career, as U.S. commander in World War I, for instance, he quite happily carried that nickname, Black Jack Pershing. So just to sum up, there is a major presence of blacks in the West. Civilian presence, a pioneering presence, cowboy presence, and a military presence. And it really was not recognized until our time. It really was minimized given the racial thinking and racial ethos up until the mid-20th century. So it was really downplayed. And it's not until later on, not till our time actually, that this role has been properly understood, and I hope it continues to be.
If you want to talk to someone about what you learned, call 610-861-5091 or text 610-324-3880.